And McManus was the kind of cop everyone trusted, steady, fearless, and devoted. Until the night she pulled the trigger on her ex-husband and turned the quiet town of Greenville upside down. What no one knew then was that the truth behind that single gunshot would expose years of obsession, betrayal, and a secret that reached far beyond one woman's fall from grace. And McManus had been the pride of the Greenville Police Department for more than 2 decades. Her record was spotless, her dedication unwavering. She was the kind of officer others aspired to be, calm under pressure, always ready to step into danger for the sake of others. In a town where everyone knew each other and wasn't just a cop, she was part of the fabric that held the community together. Parents trusted her to look out for their kids, business owners greeted her with free coffee, and her colleagues knew she could be counted on no matter what. To most people, she represented everything good about law enforcement: fairness, strength, and compassion. But behind the uniform, Anne's life had been unraveling piece by piece. The marriage that had once anchored her began to collapse after years of distance and resentment. Her husband, Patrick McManus, had been charming and ambitious when they met, a contractor with a big smile and big dreams. Over time, those dreams faded into frustration. He grew tired of Anne's long hours and her growing attachment to the badge. Arguments became a nightly ritual. When Patrick eventually left her for a younger woman named Lisa, Anne's world shattered. The home she had built was empty, the laughter gone, the silence unbearable. Her teenage son, Michael, chose to live with his father, blaming and for driving him away. Anne's work became her refuge. She volunteered for extra shifts, signed up for weekend patrols, and buried herself in paperwork just to avoid going home. To outsiders, she appeared resilient, but those who looked closely could see the exhaustion in her face. She had stopped smiling at the morning briefings, her laughter replaced by a quiet, cold focus. Some officers whispered that she'd become too serious, that the divorce had hardened her. Others ignored the signs, believing Anne could handle anything. It wasn't long before her personal pain began seeping into her work. Cases involving domestic disputes started to affect her more deeply than before. She would linger at the scene long after reports were written, staring at the victims as if seeing herself reflected in them. Sometimes she'd call back to check on them days later, even when protocol didn't require it. When she spoke about abusers, there was venom in her voice. No one could quite understand the intensity behind her words. Her supervisors noticed the change but chalked it up to stress. After all, Anne had always been dependable. They had no reason to doubt her judgment. But they didn't see what was happening outside of work. The late-night drives past Patrick's new house, the way she'd sit in her car across the street, watching the lights flicker inside. She told herself it wasn't obsession, that she was just making sure her son was okay. But deep down she knew it was something darker. In the weeks leading up to November, her behavior grew erratic. She stopped answering calls from friends, ignored her sister's visits, and isolated herself completely. She had started drinking alone, replaying old arguments in her head until the lines between past and present blurred. One night, she found a photo of Patrick and Lisa online, smiling, holding hands at a restaurant she once loved. That was the moment something inside her shifted. By the time the 911 call came through on November 12th, no one recognized the woman she had become. The dispatcher heard only fragments, muffled sobs, a brief scuffle, a gunshot, then silence. When officers arrived, they found Anne sitting on her porch, her hands trembling, her service weapon on the ground beside her. Patrick's body lay in the living room, motionless, a single bullet in his chest. Anne's uniform was stained with blood, her eyes hollow and distant. She told them he broke in, that she feared for her life. But as investigators looked around, the story didn't fit. The door was intact, the lock unbroken. His car keys were on the table next to hers. To everyone who had once called her a hero, It was unthinkable. The department's most respected officer, standing over the body of her ex-husband. The perfect cop, the symbol of justice in Greenville, had just become the center of its darkest crime. And for the first time in her career, and McManus wasn't the one searching for the truth. She was the one being searched. The morning after the shooting, Greenville awoke to disbelief. News spread fast in the small town. The respected officer, the one everyone trusted, had shot her ex-husband dead. Patrol cars blocked off in McManus's quiet street. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold wind, and curious neighbors stood at a distance whispering her name. Reporters began arriving before sunrise, their cameras pointed at the house that once symbolized safety. Inside, detectives moved carefully through every room, trying to understand what had happened the night before. The scene was unsettling. Patrick's body had been found lying on the rug in front of the couch, a single gunshot wound in his chest. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds. His wallet was still in his pocket, his watch on his wrist. Nothing appeared stolen. The gun that killed him was Anne's service weapon, one she kept locked in a drawer by her bedside. But when forensics examined it, they discovered the safety had been off for several hours before the shooting, suggesting intent rather than panic. Detective Ryan Coster was among the first to arrive. He had worked alongside Anne for years and had always admired her professionalism. Now he walked through her home like it was a stranger's. Everything felt staged, the carefully folded blanket on the couch, the mug still half full on the counter, the faint smell of cleaning products lingering in the air. To him, it didn't look like a home invaded by an intruder. It looked like a scene waiting to be explained. The first inconsistencies came quickly and claimed Patrick had broken in, yet the front door showed no damage, and his keys were sitting neatly on the table. His car was parked in the driveway, not hastily abandoned, but positioned like someone who arrived there willingly. There were no defensive injuries on, and no bruises, no torn clothing. Instead, she appeared calm, almost detached, during the initial questioning. Her voice was even, her tone steady, but her eyes revealed something else, exhaustion mixed with resignation, as if she had already accepted the worst. When detectives began searching her phone, the story grew darker. There were dozens of recent searches that raised questions. Virginia self-defense laws. How long does gunpowder residue last? And how to delete phone records. Even more concerning were the text messages she had sent in the days before the shooting. She had been messaging a close friend about Patrick's new girlfriend, writing that she couldn't stand seeing him happy after what he did to her. One message read, "I just want it all to stop." Detectives also recovered GPS data from her patrol car, showing that she had driven past Patrick's house multiple times during her off hours. At first, it seemed harmless. Maybe she was checking on her son. But after further review, they discovered she had done it nearly every night for weeks. The line between concern and obsession had blurred completely. The evidence was building, but no one wanted to believe it. The department struggled to accept that one of their own could have crossed such a line. Chief Harold Simmons, who had known Anne since she was a rookie, personally requested to oversee the investigation to ensure no bias influenced the outcome. Yet even he admitted privately that something about the case felt wrong. Too clean, too deliberate. As the hours turned into days, more details surfaced, and had called her ex-husband earlier that evening, the final call lasting only a few minutes. No one knew what was said, but phone records confirmed he left his home shortly afterward and drove straight to hers. Investigators found no indication of a forced visit. Patrick had come willingly, suggesting that, and had asked him to come over. The supposed break-in story began to crumble by the end of the week, and McManus was officially charged with second-degree murder. Her mugshot, once unimaginable to the people of Greenville, appeared on every news outlet. The community that once admired her now struggled to make sense of how their protector could have become a suspect. Some defended her, convinced there was more to the story. Others saw it as proof that no one, not even a trusted officer, was beyond corruption, and remained silent through it all. She refused to speak to the press, refused to answer questions from her former colleagues, and refused to explain what had really happened that night. To those who had known her best, her silence was the most haunting detail of all. It wasn't the silence of fear or confusion. It was the silence of someone who knew that once the truth came out, there would be no way back. As the investigation deepened, a version of McManus emerged that no one had ever seen before. What began as a case of suspected domestic violence was transforming into something far more complex, a slow descent into obsession, deceit, and control. Detectives began piecing together the months that led up to the shooting, uncovering a web of actions that hinted at premeditation rather than panic. Every detail of Anne's personal and professional life became evidence, and every secret she had buried started to surface. The most alarming discovery came from her department's internal records. 6 months before the shooting, and had quietly been placed under review for questionable use of police databases. The system showed that she had accessed personal information belonging to Patrick and his new girlfriend on several occasions, even running background checks under fake case numbers. At the time, the oversight team thought it might have been a simple clerical error. Now, it looked like something far more deliberate. She had used her badge not just to enforce the law, but to spy on those who had hurt her. Her colleagues remembered strange behavior in the weeks before the incident. Late nights spent alone in the office. Long drives in her patrol car when she wasn't assigned to any call, and a distant look in her eyes whenever Patrick's name was mentioned. One fellow officer recalled that, and had become fixated on control, convinced that people were lying to her or plotting behind her back. She kept notes on everyone, coworkers, neighbors, even her commanding officer, documenting things that didn't matter to anyone but her. The woman who once symbolized stability had begun to unravel in silence. Inside her home, investigators found a small locked drawer that revealed just how deep her obsession had gone. Inside were printed photos of Patrick and Lisa together, taken from a distance, grainy and shadowed. There were handwritten notes with dates, times, and addresses, recording every movement they made. One notebook contained what looked like a timeline of Patrick's life, his work hours, gym visits, even grocery trips. It was surveillance disguised as heartbreak. When police dug through her financial history, another shocking detail emerged, and had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Patrick only 6 months before his death, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. She had done it using her personal email, but submitted the documents from a police department computer. The policy paperwork had been signed electronically, with Patrick's signature later proven to be forged. It was a piece of evidence the prosecution would later call the moment where grief turned into greed. The psychological profile prepared for the court painted, and as a woman trapped between duty and desperation. After losing her family, her career had become her identity. When that identity began to crumble, she clung to the only kind of control she understood, the authority of the badge. She used her training, her knowledge of procedure, and her familiarity with evidence collection to craft a version of events that could protect her from consequences. But like every carefully planned act, small cracks began to show. Detectives found traces of cleaning solution near where the gun had been fired. Blood spatter patterns indicated the body had been moved slightly after the shooting. It wasn't a professional cleanup, but it was just enough to raise suspicion. The forensic team also discovered that the gun had been handled with latex gloves at some point. Though no gloves were ever found in the house, the case grew heavier by the day, each discovery peeling away the image of the honorable officer she once was. Greenville's residents felt betrayed. Parents who had trusted her with school safety now avoided mentioning her name. Former co-workers struggled between loyalty and disgust. The department, once proud of her achievements, began quietly removing her name from community plaques and training materials. Yet, even with the mounting evidence, there was still confusion about motive. Some believed she acted out of jealousy, unable to watch Patrick start over without her. Others thought it was revenge, a calculated act to punish him for taking her family and pride. But those closest to her knew it was something deeper, and had spent her life enforcing order in a chaotic world. When her own life fell into chaos, she tried to enforce order there too, even if it meant crossing every line she once swore to uphold. By the time the prosecution finished building their case, the story of McManus was no longer about a tragic mistake. It was about a woman who let pain consume her until justice itself became her weapon. The town that once saw her as its protector now saw her as a warning that even the most trusted can fall, and when they do, the damage reaches far beyond a single gunshot. The courthouse was overflowing on the first day of McManus's trial. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashed, and locals gathered in silence, waiting to hear how one of Greenville's most respected officers had become its most notorious defendant, and was led into the courtroom wearing a plain gray suit instead of her uniform. The woman who had once commanded authority with a badge and a gun now looked fragile and hollow. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor as the charges were read aloud: second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and falsifying official documents. Every word echoed through the room like a reminder of how far she had fallen. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They portrayed, and as a woman consumed by resentment, someone who used her training and access to commit the perfect crime. They described how she had manipulated her position, tracked Patrick's movements, and forged insurance documents to profit from his death. They presented the timeline of that November night: the phone call, the invitation to meet, the single gunshot. According to them, and had invited Patrick under the pretense of reconciliation, only to confront him about his new life, and ended in a moment of cold calculation. Photographs of the crime scene were projected on the screen, showing Patrick's body on the living room floor and N's weapon beside him. The jury saw the lack of forced entry, the calm arrangement of the house, and the precision of the shot. It was not chaos, the prosecution argued. It was control. They pointed to her internet searches, her fake background checks, and the insurance policy as evidence of a mind that had planned everything long before that night. The defense, led by attorney Claire Donnelly, tried to counter the image of a calculated killer with that of a broken woman. They claimed, and had lived in fear of Patrick for years, that his anger and emotional manipulation had pushed her into isolation. They presented hospital reports from years earlier showing minor injuries and notes suggesting anxiety and stress caused by domestic disputes. The defense argued that Patrick had come to her house that night threatening to take their son away permanently, and in a moment of panic, and acted to protect herself. The courtroom listened to every word, but the evidence told a different story. Forensics confirmed that Patrick's hands were clean of gunshot residue, proving he hadn't held a weapon. The autopsy showed the bullet entered at a downward angle, suggesting he was seated when it happened. And then there was the deleted text found in Ann's phone backups, a message sent 2 days before the murder that read, "He'll never hurt me again." That text became the centerpiece of the trial, a single sentence that carried more weight than hours of testimony as witnesses took the stand. The mood shifted from disbelief to quiet sorrow. Colleagues who had once called her a mentor now had to testify against her. One officer spoke about how and had changed in the months before the shooting, how she'd grown distant, distracted, and easily angered. Another described the day she was arrested, saying it was like watching a ghost in uniform. When it was Ann's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. But she chose not to speak. Her attorney had advised her to remain silent, and she followed that advice. Her face revealed nothing. No remorse, no anger, just a hollow stillness that made jurors uncomfortable. For a woman who once stood for justice, Her silence spoke louder than any words could. After a short deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all charges. The courtroom remained still as the judge read the sentence: 30 years in state prison, and showed no visible reaction. She simply nodded once, stood, and allowed herself to be led away in handcuffs. The aftermath hit Greenville hard. News outlets ran the story for weeks, calling her the fallen officer. The police department issued a statement expressing both sorrow and condemnation, acknowledging her service while distancing itself from her actions. Her home was sold, her name removed from department commendations, and her son, now an adult, changed his last name to avoid the association. For the people who had once trusted her, the trial felt like a betrayal that could never be undone. And McManus, who had spent her life chasing criminals, had become the very thing she swore to protect others from. Yet, even after her conviction, some couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't complete, that behind her silence, there was still something no one had uncovered. 2 years after and McManus began serving her sentence, the case that had once shocked Greenville faded from public attention. Her name was no longer mentioned on the local news, her photo removed from every department record. The woman who had once been the pride of the police force now spent her days behind concrete walls, her identity reduced to a number stitched onto a prison uniform. She kept to herself, working quietly in the laundry unit, rarely speaking to anyone. Other inmates viewed her with a mix of curiosity and fear. Even among criminals, there was something unsettling about a cop-turned-killer. But outside the prison walls, whispers about her case never completely died. Detectives occasionally revisited the file during training sessions, using it as a lesson about how easily power could be misused. Still, some felt uneasy about how neatly the case had been closed. Detective Ryan Coster, who had once worked beside and later helped investigate her, couldn't shake that feeling. Something in the evidence had always bothered him, a missing link that didn't fit with the narrative of a single impulsive act. When he transferred to the cold case review unit, he decided to look at the file one more time. It started with the gun. During the original investigation, forensics had recovered fingerprints that couldn't be matched to either or Patrick. The prints had been dismissed as a possible lab error, but Coster wasn't satisfied. He requested a new analysis using updated technology, and the results revealed a partial match to someone in the state's police database, a former officer named Dale Hunt. The name sent a chill down his spine. Hunt had been Ann's patrol partner for nearly 5 years before resigning suddenly, just weeks after Patrick's death. Coster began digging deeper into Hunt's background and found unsettling coincidences. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between him and in the months leading up to the murder. They had even exchanged text messages on the night of the shooting, though most had been deleted. Surveillance footage from a gas station near Ann's home that night showed Patrick's car pulling into her driveway, followed minutes later by another vehicle registered to Hunt. The footage was grainy, the figure indistinct, but it was enough to raise serious questions. When Hunt was tracked down in another state, he denied everything. He claimed he had only been offering an emotional support during her divorce, that he had nothing to do with the shooting. But his words didn't match the evidence. In his garage, investigators found an old police duffel bag containing a set of latex gloves, a spare uniform, and a revolver registered under his name, one recently cleaned but never used in any recorded case. The discovery reignited the long-dormant scandal. Greenville's quiet peace was once again broken as rumors spread that the town's darkest story might have a new chapter. Under renewed scrutiny, prosecutors began to piece together an alternate theory. Hunt and had stayed close after his resignation, bonded by frustration and resentment toward the department that had once celebrated them. Hunt's texts suggested he encouraged and to confront Patrick, possibly even to intimidate him. The two had planned a meeting, but something went wrong. Whether Hunt fired the gun or helped her cover it up remained uncertain. But the prints on the weapon and his sudden disappearance could no longer be ignored. When Coster visited and imprisoned to question her about Hunt, she didn't flinch at the mention of his name. For a long moment, she stared at the wall, then said quietly that she had nothing more to add. It was the only time she had spoken to law enforcement since her sentencing. As Coster prepared to leave, she finally added one final line. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Those were the last words she ever spoke about the case. Months later, Hunt was arrested and charged as an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. The evidence was circumstantial, but the timeline and his fingerprints tied him to the scene. The new trial cast doubt on the original conviction, but Anne refused to appeal her sentence. She remained behind bars, accepting her fate in silence. Whether out of guilt, loyalty, or fear, no one knew. The revelation changed Greenville once again. The story of McManus was no longer a simple tale of a cop who lost control. It became a haunting study of how power, obsession, and misplaced trust can destroy everything. Two officers, once symbols of protection, had turned against the very laws they swore to uphold. Years later, when people spoke of the case, they didn't just talk about the murder. They talked about the warning it carried. And McManus's fall wasn't just about one fatal moment. It was about how a lifetime of discipline and duty could be erased by pain, and how even those sworn to protect can become the architects of tragedy. Her story remained a dark echo in Greenville's history, a reminder that sometimes the line between hero and criminal isn't crossed in an instant. It's eroded slowly, until there's nothing left on the other side.